The sky above Aethen Four was burning. It had not always been this way. Once, the sky by day had been a deep violet, and by night it was strewn with soft, silver stars. The Selhari had looked upon it for thousands of years, singing songs about it, naming the stars, and weaving stories for their children. But now, the sky was torn asunder. It was full of smoke and light, a wrong kind of light. The glow of burning ships, explosions high in the atmosphere, the slow and terrible work of a fleet that had not come as guests, but with the intent to destroy. On the ground, in the deep stone corridors of the Great Council, the oldest archivist, Van Sol, stood motionless, staring at a screen. He was old, even by Selhari standards. His body was tall and thin, like most of his kin. His long arms bent at two joints instead of one. His skin, if one could call it that, was a deep blue and emitted a faint glow. The Selhari were bioluminescent. It was a part of their biology, a soft light that intensified with strong emotion and dimmed when they were weary or sad. Currently, Van Sol's glow was very dim. It had been dim for 3 days. Around him, the council hall was full of noise. Other council members rushed back and forth, shouting to one another, waving data pads, pointing at projection screens, displaying maps of the planet's orbital defense line or what was left of it. The Vorkai had first struck the outer defensive grid, then the mid-range stations. Now they were working on the inner ring, and after that, there would be nothing left between the planet's surface and the full might of the 7th Conquest Fleet. Council member Divan Ray, a young Selhari with bright orange markings on her arms, ran up to Van Sol and grabbed his shoulder. "Van Sol," she said quickly, "the Minister of Defense needs the historical archive of Archaea attack patterns, past invasions, tactical data. Everything we have. Can you access it?" "Yes," Van Sol replied. "Can you access it? Then go. There is no time." "And then?" he asked slowly, not taking his eyes off the screen. "There is no point." Divan Ray stared at him. Her own glow flickered with frustration. "What do you mean, no point? We must fight. We have to." "The Vorkai have conquered 14 worlds in the last 60 years, Van Sol said calmly. All 14 had defensive grids. All 14 sent emergency signals to the conclave of worlds. All 14 fell within a week of first contact. Our outer ring fell in 11 hours. He paused. "What tactical data do I need to find?" Divan Ray opened her mouth, then closed it. She left quickly because she had no answer for him. Van Sol turned back to his screen. He was not looking at the combat reports like the others. He was not looking at the orbital grid maps, nor the casualty reports from the northern continent, nor the desperate messages sent to Conclave headquarters pleading for help that would not come. He saw all of that. He understood it well enough. He was currently watching something that had appeared on his personal monitor 40 minutes ago and had not left his mind since. It was a signal. It was not a new signal, nor anything from the battlefield outside. It was old, older than Van Sol himself, older than any living creature on Aethen Four, older than the Vorkai Dominion had existed as a political entity. It came on a frequency that, as far as the Conclave knew, had been dead for 3,000 years. A frequency that no modern civilization used, one that had a single entry in the official communication registry under the name of a species that most modern scholars considered a myth. The entry read, "Reserved Human Diplomatic Band. Last activity, Year of Zero Silence." Van Sol had been an archivist for 60 years. During that time, he had read nearly every document in the Selhari National Archive and a significant portion of the Conclave's general database. He had read about all the wars, all the treaties, all the lost civilizations, all the first contact records. Over those 60 years, he had developed a habit of treating history as something real and physical, not just words on a page, but actual remnants of what had truly occurred. He believed that if one read carefully enough, history could still surprise. And now, it was surprising him. He pressed a key, and the signal enlarged on his screen. It was short. It was encrypted with a cipher that the Conclave's system struggled to crack, not because the cipher was particularly sophisticated, but because it was so old that no active decryption library held the base keys to it. Van Sol had spent the last 40 minutes finding those keys in the deep archive. He had just finished. The message was decrypted before him. It was 3 words in the old galactic standard, a trade language that had been used across all known space before the current dialect replaced it. 3 words. "We have seen everything." Van Sol read them 3 times. Then he sat down. which was unusual for him as he usually preferred to stand, and he sat very quietly for nearly a minute. Then, he opened the closed archive. The closed archive was not a secret. It was not locked behind security codes or prohibited from access. It was simply a section of the archive that no one ever looked at because it was considered full of legends, exaggerations, and stories that old civilizations told when they tried to make themselves feel important. In practice, it was the mythological section, even if it was under the header of historical records. Van Sol knew what was there. He had read it all a long time ago, in the first years of his career when he still had the time and energy to read everything. He had found it fascinating. At the time, most of his colleagues considered it embarrassing old nonsense that real scholars should have left behind. He had no trouble finding the human files. They were larger than the files for most species, which in itself was interesting. Someone, a very long time ago, had put a lot of effort into collecting and preserving information about humanity. When that person clearly believed it was important, the oldest documents were simple physical descriptions. Humans were bipedal, 2 legs, 2 arms, 1 head. They were extremely fragile by galactic standards. Their skin had no armor, no scales, no natural protection. They could not survive in a vacuum without suits. They were vulnerable to dozens of environmental conditions that other species could endure without difficulty. Their lifespan was surprisingly short, 60 to 100 years of their home world under natural conditions. In a galaxy where many species lived for centuries or millennia, human life was considered almost embarrassingly short. And yet, the next section of the archive was different in tone. It was written by a scholar of the Tetherian Collective, a civilization that no longer existed and had been absorbed by the Conclave 3,000 years ago. It had the cautious, deliberate style of someone who carefully chose their words because they feared they would not be believed. The scholar described a period roughly 4,000 years prior to the present, when humanity first made contact with the wider galaxy. They arrived, the scholar wrote, as an insignificant species from a single star system on the outer rim. No colonies, no allies, no particular advantages in technology. They lagged behind the major civilizations of the time by several centuries in most areas. Within 500 years, they caught up to everyone. Not because they were given technology, not because they traded for it or stole it, but by developing it sometimes from scratch, and sometimes by looking at what already existed and finding 3 different ways to improve it. The scholar used a word that Van Sol had to look up because it was not common in the modern galactic standard. The word meant something like relentless ingenuity, the quality of never stopping, never admitting that a problem could not be solved, never treating a closed door as anything other than a door that had not yet been opened. But it was the next section that Van Sol remembered forever, the part that had stayed with him all these years as something he did not know what to do with. It was the record of the first major war humanity waged against another cosmic civilization, a conflict now called the Breached Wars, which most modern scholars considered a minor historical footnote. The opposing civilization had attacked human colonies 3 times, assuming the humans would either surrender or be unable to fight back at the necessary scale. They were wrong on both counts, but Van Sol was not struck by the fact that humans had won. Many civilizations won wars. He was struck by how they fought. Other species, the scholar noted, go to war for understandable reasons: territory, resources, survival, dominance. They fight until the cost becomes too high, and then they stop. They have a practical relationship with violence. It is a tool, and like any tool, it is put away when the work is done or when it breaks you. Humans fought for reasons. The scholar had used that word and underlined it, which was unusual for a scholar writing in that period. Not just for territory, not just for survival, but for something that had no physical form: justice, principle, memory of the dead, the protection of people they had never met and would never meet. They could suffer terrible losses in a war they were technically losing and still not stop, because they had decided that the reason was more important than the cost. The scholar concluded with a line that Van Sol had remembered by heart since he read it a decade ago. Do not wound a human and expect them to die from it. Expect them to remember. He scrolled further. Past the breached wars, past the period of early expansion, past the first conclave negotiations where humanity, apparently, was a frustrating participant because they constantly insisted on including clauses regarding the rights of non-member species that no one else considered important. past the long middle period of galactic history during which humans colonized dozens of systems, built alliances, fought a few more wars, and generally became one of the most significant civilizations in known space. And then he reached the section labeled Silence. 3,000 years ago, on a date precisely recorded in every existing archive, all human signals ceased. All human ships returned to human space. All human diplomats politely, formally, without explanation, said goodbye and went home. The borders of human space went quiet. Ships that approached reported a lack of hostile actions, a lack of communication, nothing, just silence. There were many theories: plague, internal collapse, transcendence into a higher form of existence, voluntary isolation. Some scientists claimed they had simply gone extinct, that their short lifespan had finally caught up to the civilization as a whole, or that some internal conflict had burned them to the ground. Van Saul had never fully believed any of these theories. He looked back at his screen at the 3 words, still glowing there in the old galactic standard. "We have seen everything." A sound made him lift his head. It was one of the young Selhari assistant archivists named Fenlo, who worked the night shift and mostly kept to himself. Fenlo stood in the doorway of the main archive hall with an expression Van Saul had never seen before, a wide, stunned expression. His glow was pulsating in fast, irregular flashes, which meant extreme surprise. "Elder Van Saul," Fenlo said. His voice was not entirely steady. "The Deep Space Relay Network, the Deep Space Sensors, they just sent an emergency alert." Van Saul was already standing. What did they detect? Fenlo opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "Ships," he said. "Many ships, moving from the outer rim. They are moving faster than our sensor models consider physically possible." He took a breath. "But the readings are consistent across 17 separate relay stations, so the system is certain it is not an error." He paused. "The Vorkai BattleNet also noted it across all their encrypted frequencies. The last 4 minutes, total silence." Van Saul felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not hope exactly. Not yet. Something quieter than hope. Something that felt like a very old door that had been closed for 3,000 years was beginning to open very slowly. "How many ships?" he asked. Fenlo looked at his data pad. He looked at it again, as if he expected the number to change if he checked a second time. It did not change. He looked at Van Saul. "We don't have a number," he said. "The sensor network cannot count them. There are too many." Outside, the burning sky shimmered. For a moment, just for a moment, the sounds of the Vorkai bombardment seemed to freeze, as if even the weapons were not sure what to do, as if the war itself had heard something and was waiting to see what would happen next. Van Saul returned to his screen. He looked one more time at the 3 words. Then he looked through the high stone window, at the damaged sky, at the smoke and fire and the distant outlines of the enemy ships still hanging in orbit like dark stones. And he thought about what he had read all those years ago, about a civilization that never knew how to put things off, that remembered everything, that had looked at the galaxy 3,000 years ago and made a decision, a quiet, deliberate, patient decision, and then vanished to carry it out. He thought about the signal on the dead frequency. "We have seen everything." He thought about the silence in Archai, and for the first time in 3 days, Van Saul's glow began to intensify. "Fenlo," he said quietly. "Yes, Elder? Wake the full council. Everyone. Immediately." He paused. "And tell them to look at the outer rim sensors. Tell them to look carefully." He folded his long arms and continued to look at the sky. "Tell them that I believe something that has been sleeping for a very long time has just opened its eyes." Fenlo hesitated. "And if they ask me what it is?" Van Saul waited, the burning sky reflected in his eyes. His glow was steady and growing. "Tell them," he said, "that it is the answer to every distress signal this galaxy has sent into the silence and received nothing in return." He took a final glance at the 3 words on the screen. "Tell them that the humans have heard us and have come." Outside, in the cold darkness, far above the burning world, the outer rim sensor network was still counting, still trying to find an upper limit for the number of ships moving in perfect formation along the edge of known space. It had not found it yet. The formation moved on, patient, precise, and absolutely massive. That is how something moves that has been preparing for a very long time and has finally finished its preparations. It was moving toward the light. It was moving toward the fire. It was moving toward Aethen Four, where a world was burning, and a very old archivist stood by a stone window with folded arms and a glow burning brightly for the first time in many days. And it was not slowing down. Warlord Drekhan Khan had never lost a campaign. He did not say this out loud very often because, in Vorkai culture, boasting about one's track record was considered a sign of insecurity. A true warrior did not need to announce his victories. His presence was the announcement. But it was a fact. And it was a fact that defined him just as bones define a body. It was the structure beneath everything else invisible, but supporting all. He was large, even by Vorkai standards. His people were of reptilian origin with thick scales, heavy bones, wide flat heads, and eyes positioned wide for excellent peripheral vision. Most Vorkai were a dull brown, the color of the stony homeworld from which they came. Drekhan was darker than average, almost black, with deep green markings along his neck and shoulders, indicating his rank and bloodline. He did not wear ceremonial armor on his flagship. Ceremonial armor was for parades and political events. On a warship in the middle of a campaign, he wore the insignia of his rank and nothing more, because anything else would be a performance, and he did not perform. He stood at the main tactical display of the Pride of Vorkai, his flagship, the largest warship of the 7th Conquest Fleet, and watched the final stages of the collapse of the Selhari orbital grid with the calm satisfaction of a man watching something happen exactly as he had expected. "Outer defensive ring completely neutralized, Warlord," said Fleet Commander Aerosol, who stood to his left. Aerosol was young for her rank, quick-thinking, extremely efficient. She was one of the few officers whom Drekhan allowed to brief him without a formal greeting. "The inner ring will fall within 6 hours. After that, the planet's surface will be open." "Good," Drekhan said. "The Selhari sent 3 more emergency signals to Conclave headquarters in the last 2 hours," Aerosol continued. "No response, as expected. The Conclave has no military forces within range of response, and the nearest member state with independent warships is 11 days of standard transit away." 11 days, Drekhan Khan said. "We will be finished in 6. He was likely right. Campaigns always went the same way. The target civilization had a defensive grid that looked impressive on paper and crumbled under real pressure. They sent signals asking for help. The help did not come. They either surrendered or died in place. Either outcome was acceptable to the Vorkai Dominion. A civilization that surrendered could be used for labor. A civilization that fought to the end was eliminated as a future problem. Both had their practical utility. He was about to request the latest surface mapping data when a sound from the other side of the bridge made him turn. The sound was unusual, which was why it caught his attention. It was the sound of a surprised Vorkai officer, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, followed by sudden silence. Vorkai officers were not supposed to be surprised. They were always meant to control their reactions. When one of them made such a sound, it meant something was truly wrong. The officer was Sivak, the fleet's chief intelligence analyst. Sivak was a small Vorkai, smaller than average, with lighter coloring and quick, darting eyes. He was not a warrior in the traditional sense, and he knew it, so he pursued intelligence instead of field command. He was very good at his job. He was usually the calmest person in any room, because he had a habit of knowing things before they became problems. Right now, he did not look calm. He stood at his station, his gaze fixed on his screen, and his scales were doing what Vorkai scales did when their owner was under stress, lying flat and tight against the skin, making him look thinner than usual. "Sivak," Drekhan said. His voice was neutral, which for a Vorkai warlord meant, "You have exactly 1 chance to explain yourself." Sivak lifted his head. He looked at Aerosol, then back at Drekhan, then said in a very quiet voice, "Warlord, I need to show you something. I believe it should be a private briefing." Drekhan stared at him for a long minute, then nodded once and walked to a side chamber adjoining the main bridge. Sivak followed him. The door closed behind them. The side chamber was small and functional, a table, 4 chairs, a wall screen. Drekhan stood, rather than sitting, which he almost always did. Sivak sat because his legs were not entirely steady, and he did not trust them to hold him without visibility. The outer rim sensors detected a large formation of unidentified vessels approaching from deep space, Sivak began. "I am sure you will receive the full report shortly. The formation is very large, larger than any fleet in the current Conclave records." He paused. "When the first alert came in, I performed standard procedure, cross-referencing all known military forces, all known species, all recorded fleet movements." He paused again. There were no matches, which means it is either a sensor error or an unknown contact, Drekan said. Yes. And the sensor data is confirmed by multiple independent relay stations, so I have ruled out error. Sivak's claws ran for a moment along the edge of the table, a nervous gesture he usually controlled. So I accessed the full archive. Not just the current records, the deep archive. Historical files going back 3,000 years. He looked at the warlord. I found a match. Drekan said nothing. He waited. Sivak pressed a key. The wall screen came to life, showing a file header. The date in the file made Drekan's eyes narrow slightly. 3,000 years ago. The file was classified at the highest level, a classification designation Drekan had seen on files before, but rarely, and only for things the Dominion wanted very carefully forgotten. This file, Sivak said, is a record of the 7th colonial contact event, year 3004 before current era. It is not taught in military academies. It is not included in the standard historical record. It has been reclassified to this security level twice in 3,000 years, each time under different Dominion administrations. He folded his hands on the table. I found it only because the search algorithm I used was looking for fleet signature patterns, not historical events. It matched the signal characteristics from the archive. What was this contact event? Drekan asked. Sivak told him. 3,000 years ago, a Vorkai colonial expansion fleet, 40 warships, a significant force for that era, was operating on the outer edge of explored space. They encountered a small, newly founded colony on a secondary planet. The colony was inhabited by a species not yet officially registered in the wider galactic community, and the species was bipedal, soft-skinned, and had no orbital weaponry. The fleet commander, an old order warlord named Getbon, assessed it as a trivial conquest. The fleet moved in. None of them returned. Drekan fell silent. 40 ships, he said. 40 ships, Sivak confirmed. The colony had no fleet, no orbital weaponry. What it had, according to the partial transmission received from one of the Vorkai ships before all signals were lost, was a very large number of inhabitants who clearly did not want to wait for a formal confrontation. The transmission describes how they used their own colonial infrastructure as weapons, accelerating metal cargo containers toward the Vorkai ships using their loading systems, reprogramming the colony's automated mining equipment to target the ship hulls, and capturing the weapons of the first landing parties, and using them before the landing parties finished their assault. He paused. The last transmission from Getbon's ship says, and I quote, "They do not fight like a colony defending itself. They fight like something that has been waiting for a reason." Drekan was now looking at Sivak's wall screen. His eyes moved across the data. "The species of the colony," he said. "Who were they?" Sivak uttered the word. It was a short word, one syllable. It was a word that, in most modern galactic archives, appeared in the category of extinct or mythological civilizations. It was a word that, when spoken in the right context, made some very old scholars stop and listen carefully. "Humans," Sivak said. When the word hung in the air for a moment, Drekan turned and looked at him. His expression did not change. It almost never did. But behind his eyes was something that Sivak, who was very good at reading Vorkai expressions, identified as the earliest, most controlled stage of a reaction that the warlord was trying very hard not to give away. "Humans," Drekan said, "are extinct. They have been gone for 3,000 years. They are a footnote in conclave history." "Yes," Sivak said, "that is the assertion of all current archives." He pressed another key, and a second file opened. But I found something else in the same deep archive section. A record from 1,100 years ago, midway between the silence and today, in which a conclave scout ship, operating at the outer boundary of what used to be human space, discovered signs of active construction on a planetary body. Large-scale construction. The scouting group filed a report. The report was reviewed at the conclave level and classified. The reason for the classification was to prevent public disorder. Sivak lifted his head. Someone knew, warlord. At some point, someone knew that they were still there, and a decision was made to say nothing. The room was very quiet. Drekan Khan walked to the window. Outside the ship, space was dark and cold, full of the distant debris of the Selhari defensive platforms. He looked at it without seeing. He was thinking very quickly, precisely, without decoration, as he always thought about tactical problems. "The formation on the outer rim sensors," he said. I assume it is them. Sivak said, yes. Do you believe they have been in their own space for 3,000 years? Not dying, not collapsing, but building? I do. Show me the sensor data on the formation. Sivak displayed it. He had already run the numbers 3 times, hoping to find an error. There was no error. The formation was moving at a speed exceeding everything in the Conclave's current technological range, not by a small amount, but by a significant factor. The energy signatures were unlike any recorded drive technology, and the number continued to grow because the outer rim sensor network was still defining the full shape of the formation, still processing data. And the number it had reached so far was already the largest fleet figure Sivak had ever seen in any record, historical or current. Drekhan looked at the number. He said nothing for a long time. Then, how much time do we have until their arrival at system Aethen Four? At their current speed? Approximately 9 hours. Finish the planet before they arrive. Sivak hesitated. This was not something he usually did with the warlord. Sir, if the historical record is accurate, if this formation is what I think it is, then completing the Selhari operation is unlikely to change the outcome, based on the colonial contact event, based on the message they sent. What message? Sivak hoped to delay this part. The formation transmitted a signal approximately 40 minutes ago. Very short. 3 words in the old galactic standard. He read them. We have seen everything. Drekhan looked at the sensor display for a long time at the shape of the formation that became clearer as the relays updated, at the speed indicator that did not decrease, at the energy signature that no Vorkai engineer could fully explain. Send the cultural files on humans to my personal terminal, he said finally. Everything we have, including what we deleted. He turned away from the window. His face was calm, his voice was steady. He was Warlord Drekhan, and he had never lost a campaign. I want to understand what I am dealing with. He walked to the door and opened it. On the main bridge, Aerosol and the other officers were already exchanging looks. They had begun to receive the full sensor reports, and their expressions showed the early stages of confusion passing into something else. Drekhan returned to the bridge and spoke. Continue the operation, he said, loud enough for the whole bridge to hear. Selhari, full speed, and pass the word to the subfleet commanders. I want combat readiness for all vessels by the time I finish my review. He paused. Something is coming. I intend to be ready for it. No one on the bridge asked what was coming. They were Vorkai warriors. They prepared first, then asked later. Only Sivak, following him, allowed himself a moment of private honesty when he looked one more time at the sensor display at the formation, at the number that had grown again while they were in the side room, at the drive signals that should not have been. He thought, we are looking at what 3,000 years of preparation looks like. He thought, we should have left that colony alone. And in the space between the Covenant and the approaching edge of the human armada, the stars were very clear and very cold and very, very numerous, like all the years that had passed since the silence, each one burning quietly and patiently in the dark, waiting for this exact moment. The channel remained open. The formation continued to resolve. Drekhan stood on his bridge and looked at the screen, saying nothing. And somewhere deep in the cold silence of the bridge, where no one could hear it, a thought began to form in his head, a thought that had never had to be asked in 14 campaigns, a thought that the entire Vorkai Dominion had not asked in 3,000 years of expansion because there had never been anything in the galaxy that made it necessary. Who are you? Drekhan Khan opened a private channel. That in itself was unusual for him. All his other communications with hostile forces were short, formal, and one-sided. He spoke, they listened. He told them what would happen. Then it happened. That was how campaigns worked. There was no exchange, no dialogue, no need for a private line to one ship that had parked between his fleet and the target and was waiting with the patience of something that had learned patience over a very long time. But the weapon systems dimmed and then lit up again. And the formation on the edge of sensor range continued to resolve, continued to grow, continued to unfold like something that did not fit anything in the Vorkai tactical database. Sivak showed him the updated comparative fleet figures with the expression of a man who would very much like to stop knowing what he knew. So, Drekhan opened a private channel. My question, he said, when the Vorkai returned to the platform and the channel confirmed it was private, was not rhetorical. Voss looked at him. I know, she said. Sit if you like. This will take a few minutes. He did not sit. Vorkai commanders did not sit during active combat operations, but he remained on the channel, which was a sort of answer. Voss sat. She paused, not gathering strength, she had already gathered that, but taking the short gap between one thing and the next that she always took when a conversation was about to go somewhere that mattered. "I will tell you about Earth," she said. "Your home world," he said. "Yes." She folded her hands on the table. Most species, when they describe the history of their homeworld to an outsider, start with the good parts, the achievements, the discoveries, what they are proud of. I will start differently. She told him about war, not the wars humanity had fought with other species. Those came later. She told him about the wars humans had fought among themselves for thousands of years. Continent against continent, nation against nation, city against city. She described the scale of it simply, without softening the numbers. Tens of millions dead in single conflicts. Entire populations wiped off the face of the earth. Landscapes turned to ash. She described the weapons humanity had invented specifically for the efficient killing of large numbers of other humans, and how those weapons were perfected generation after generation because humans were very good at perfecting things, even when those things were terrible. Drekhan said nothing. He listened. His expression was that of a man who expected to hear a story about weakness and was not hearing it. "We almost destroyed ourselves," Voss said. "Several times. Not once, not by accident. By choice. By the choices of people who decided that what they wanted was worth the price, and then discovered that the price was too high only after it had already been paid." She paused. "We also developed, in the midst of all this, the idea of rights. The idea that every person, not just the strong, not just those of the right bloodline or the right nation, yes, every person had a basic right to dignity, safety, and the opportunity to make their own choices." She looked at Drekhan. "We invented both genocide and human rights, sometimes in the same century. That is who we are." He paused. "That is a contradiction," he said. "Yes," Voss said. "We know. We have lived inside that contradiction for a very long time. It is uncomfortable." She paused. "But it has one practical effect that I think is relevant to your situation. We are the only species in the known galaxy that has experienced, from the inside, what happens when the strong decide that the weak simply do not matter. We did it to ourselves. We know exactly what it leads to. We know how much it costs. Honor. We cannot see it happening to someone else and treat it as someone else's problem." On every receiver that was still tracking the broadcast, and there were many, because the emergency relay was still open, because Voss had said she wanted everyone to hear this, and no one had closed it, the words spread across star systems at the speed of light. In Conclave headquarters, in a room full of senior diplomats from 12 different species, people had stopped their own emergency meeting to watch the broadcast. Some of them were old enough to have read historical files about humanity, and they sat in the cautious silence of people hearing confirmation of something they had half believed for a very long time. In the archive room on Aethen Four, Van Saul stopped moving. He stood before his screen and watched and listened with the complete, concentrated attention of a man who had waited his whole life to see something he had been told was only a legend. Fenlo, who stood next to him, said quietly, "Elder Van Saul, she is describing us what the Vorkai did to our colonies. She is describing it to him directly." "Yes," Van Saul said. He did not take his eyes off the screen. "She is telling him the story of her own species to explain why they came." "Yes," Fenlo paused. "This is the strangest way I have ever seen someone deliver an ultimatum." "It is not an ultimatum," Van Saul said. "An ultimatum says, do this, or we will hurt you. She is saying, do this because it is right, and if you refuse, we will stop you anyway. But we would prefer that you understood why." "That is different." He paused. "You know, this is, if the archive is accurate, very human." On the Covenant, Voss moved on to the reason for the silence. She described it without drama, just clearly, as she described everything. 3,000 years ago, humanity had looked at the galaxy and seen a pattern, not a new pattern, a familiar one, the same pattern that had led to some of the worst things in their own history. Civilizations with large fleets took what they wanted from those who had smaller fleets, and those who had smaller fleets called for help, and help rarely came, because everyone looked out for themselves. It was an old logic, the logic that said might is right, and the strong owe nothing to the weak. "We argued about this on our home world for thousands of years," Voss said. "Every time we thought we had settled it, it came back. And every time it came back, People died. Many people. She looked at the warlord. When we went into the galaxy and saw that the same argument was being played out on a larger scale, we had to make a decision. We could try to stop it from within, join the conclave, build alliances, try to slowly influence things. Or we could do what we had always been best at doing. That was to return home, take a clear look at the problem, and create something that could truly solve it, not just push it aside. You left the galaxy, Drekhan said. The word he used was not quite left. It was a Vorkai word meaning something closer to withdrew from one's responsibilities. No, Voss said. We made a long-term decision. There is a difference between leaving and retreating. When you leave, you stop caring. When you retreat, you are preparing to return. She paused. We watched the whole time, everything that happened. We recorded it. We compiled a complete historical record of every conflict, every conquest, every civilization that was dismantled by someone larger, including this one. She briefly pointed to the data file she had shown him earlier. We did not disappear. We just went silent, and we built. 3,000 years, Drekhan said. It was not a question. 3,000 years, Voss confirmed. Because if we were going to return and say that what you were doing was wrong, that the predation of civilizations that cannot defend themselves is wrong, we needed to be in a position where we could do more than just say it. She met his gaze. We needed to have the ability to make it true, not just today, but forever. Silence followed. Not an uncomfortable silence, a silence of reflection. Then Drekhan said something that surprised her. He said it quietly, as if he were not entirely sure he wanted to say it out loud. In my language, he said, there is no word for what you are describing. He paused. Doing something to stop something else, not because it threatens you, not because you were ordered to, not for the sake of gain or territory or survival, but because it is right. He seemed to be working through the concept in real time, turning it over with the cautious attention of a man encountering an idea that had no basis in his existing worldview. We have words for honor and battle, for loyalty to the fleet, for the glory of conquest. We have no word for what you are describing. I know, Voss said softly. How is it possible? He asked without hostility. He asked it as a man asks a question to which he truly cannot find an answer. A civilization that would spend 3,000 years preparing to stop something from which it gains no benefit, that would come here, to a system that does not belong to them, to protect a species they had never met. We have met them now, Voss said, in a sense, and to do it not for territory, not for resources, nor for any reason that rational calculation would justify. He paused. This is irrational. Voss almost smiled. It was a very small thing, a brief upward movement in the corner of her mouth. You are right, she said. By a certain kind of calculation, it is irrational. The cost is very high. The gain for us in material terms is almost zero. She looked at him firmly. We came anyway, because some things are more important than calculation, and that is what our history taught us. We are not interested in the galaxy learning that the same way we did. The private channel held them both in silence for a moment. Then, on his bridge, there was movement. One of the deputy commanders, a larger Vorkai with aggressive coloring, moving with the fast confidence of a man who had already made a decision, pushed into the frame behind Drekhan and spoke loud enough for the channel to catch it. His name, as Voss would later learn, was Deputy Warlord Greffon, and he had been through the toughest campaigns of the Dominion, and sincerely believed the only real answer to any challenge was the one that came from weapons systems. He was not interested in the conversation. He was not interested in what the humans said, or what Drekhan thought, or what 3,000 years of careful preparation looked like outside. He was interested in the fact that there was one enemy ship within range, and a planet below that was not yet finished, and a fleet behind him that was still capable of fighting, and that the only thing stopping all of this from resolving in the obvious order was a warlord standing on his bridge and talking to a small, soft-skinned creature on a medium-sized ship. He said 4 words, "We do not surrender," and then he gave the order, not to Drekhan, but to his own ship, a direct order to his personal flagship and the 6 closest ships to him. Strike formation, aimed at Aethen Four, weapons ready. Moving fast, not toward the Covenant, toward the planet, because Greffon was no longer trying to win. He had passed that stage. He was making a statement. He was speaking in a language he understood better than any other. We are Vorkai, and we do not bend. And if we cannot win, then at least we will make sure we take something with us. Drekhan Khan turned away from the screen. His face changed, not from anger, but from something more ancient and heavier than anger. Voss was already on her feet. She looked at the tactical tape on her secondary screen, at the 7 Vorkai ships that were racing toward the surface of the planet, and she closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds she used to fully grasp the reality of the situation, that she was close, very close, and that sometimes closeness is not enough, and that now, on the planet below, there were people who were counting on the next decisions being made correctly. She opened her eyes. She looked at Drekhan, who was still on the channel, who was looking at her with an expression she would later describe in her journal as the face of a man watching 2 worlds collide and unsure which one he was standing on. She said, "I am sorry that this happened, sincerely." She paused. "But I made a promise to the people on this planet. I intend to keep it." She turned to the crew. She did not raise her voice. She did not change her tone. She gave the order with the same calmness with which she did everything else, and the only difference was the weight beneath it. The weight of someone who had endured for a very long time and was not going to endure anymore. "Open the fleet channel," she said. "Tell them to move." The fleet channel opened at 3:14 Standard Time, and the order passed through it like current through a wire. Fast, clean, and with absolute certainty. For the crews of the human armada, it was no surprise. They had been at full combat readiness for the last 4 hours. They had been watching the broadcast from the Covenant, the same broadcast the Conclave receivers were watching, the same broadcast Van Sol was watching in his archive room. They had listened to Admiral Voss speak, and they had waited. And now, the wait was over, and what they had come here to do was beginning. The Armada moved. It did not move the way military fleets moved in most species' histories, in a wide, aggressive attack. Weapons firing. Everything aimed forward in a blunt display of force. Here, it moved with a precision that only comes from very long practice. Every ship in the formation knew exactly where it was heading and what its role was. There were no redundant orders, no confusion, no delays. The formation split into sections as it moved. Some headed to the outer combat zones. Some moved to cover the orbital approaches. Some moved straight and fast toward the 7 Vorkai ships that were burning as they headed toward the surface of Aethen Four. The 7 Vorkai ships were fast. Greffon had made sure of that. He had chosen the fastest ships from the strike group when he gave the order, because he was not a fool in tactics. Even if his decision was not tactical, he perhaps believed that speed would play the deciding role, that if he moved fast enough, the human fleet would not be able to react in time, that the planet would burn before anyone could stop it, and this would become his own answer to everything Voss had said over the channel. He was wrong not because the human ships were faster, although some of them were, but because the human fleet had not waited for him to move before it started calculating where he was going. The moment Greffon stood on the bridge and spoke those 4 words, the human tactical network noted the change in his posture, the shift in his movement, the direction his eyes were pointed, and began adjusting. By the time his ships left the formation and engaged their engines, 3 human ships had already occupied the intercept points. The first human ship to reach the intercept point was a midweight cruiser called the HSV Meridian. It came in at such an angle that it forced Greffon's lead ship to change trajectory or collide, and it held its angle without deflection, without hesitation, without any sign that the crew on board was concerned by the mathematics of 2 large objects moving toward a single point in space at high speed. Greffon's lead ship changed trajectory. It had to. Geometry left no other option. The second and third human ships pushed the remaining 6 Vorkai ships into a narrow corridor, not surrounding them, not firing on them, but using precise positioning to make any angle other than the one pointing away from the planet geometrically difficult. It was like watching someone herding animals, a comparison that would have caused Greffon's rage if he had heard it. But it was that comparison that several Selhari, watching the orbital tapes, later used in their stories. But the most important was the 7th ship, the one that was at the end of Greffon's formation, the one that lagged slightly, the one that was in the gap that the 2 flanking human ships had not had time to fully close. It was the largest of the 7, Greffon's flagship, the Iron Fang of Vorkai. And it did not change trajectory. It was still aimed at the planet. At this distance, a ship the size of the Iron Fang, moving at such speed, had enough mass and inertia to cause catastrophic damage to the surface upon impact. Greffon, at this moment, was not planning to retreat. He had made his decision. He had said what he believed. The Iron Fang would complete its run. On the bridge of the HSV Covenant, Voss watched the tactical tape and felt what she always felt at such moments. Not fear, but a clear and complete understanding of what was at stake and how much it would cost to do the right thing. She opened a direct channel to the Meridian. "Commander Chen," she said. "Admiral," said the voice on the other end. "Commander Lin Chen, 37 years old, 12 years in the fleet." Steady voice. "The Iron Fang will collide with the surface if it is not stopped," Voss said. "I need you to place the Meridian in its path." A brief pause. No hesitation calculation. The kind of pause a very good officer uses to ensure they fully understand an order before executing it. "That is a full collision intercept, Admiral," Chen said. "At their current speed and mass, we will receive significant hull damage, possibly critical." "Yes," Voss said. Another pause. Shorter. "Understood. The Meridian is moving." What happened next was observed by all tapes tracking the battle, and was recorded in full resolution by 6 independent sensor platforms, and was later used in all academies teaching military and diplomatic personnel for the next 200 years. Not because it was the largest or most dramatic event of that day. It was not, but because it clearly and without ambiguity demonstrated how humans make a decision. The Meridian stood in the path of the Iron Fang and held its position. It did not fire. It did not threaten. It simply stopped in the middle of the trajectory and allowed its mass and presence to say what needed no words of any weapons system: "You shall not pass." And the Iron Fang collided with the Meridian at a glancing angle, not head-on, because the Meridian crew had positioned the impact at an angle to deflect rather than absorb. The sound of the collision, caught by the Selhari orbital monitors, was a deep, resonant strike, like a bell being struck hard. The Meridian spun out, leaving behind debris from its port sector. The engines flickered. The Iron Fang was thrown from its trajectory by the impact, spinning in a slow arc that took it away from the planet and into open space. The planet was safe. On the bridge of the Meridian, emergency systems were already working. The hull breach was localized. The engines were damaged but not destroyed. The crew had withstood the collision in their impact harnesses and had come out of it shaken, bruised, and as the medical officer later confirmed, completely alive. Commander Chen opened a channel to the Covenant. "Hull breach on decks 5 through 7, she said. "Engine power at 40%. Status of crew." A short pause. The sound of confirmation. "All present. Minor injuries. No fatalities." Voss exhaled, having held her breath since she gave the order. "Excellent work, Commander. Excellent work." On Aethen Four, in the council hall, several Selhari council members who had been watching the broadcast broke into sound. Not words, but an instinctive vocalization of people who had just seen something happen and were not sure it would go in the right direction. Fenlo made a sound as if all the air were leaving him. Vansal stood before his screen, completely motionless. He watched the tactical display showing how the Iron Fang was uselessly spinning in open space. His glow was the brightest it had been in years. The battle was not over. In the wider orbital space, the main battle continued. The Vorkai fleet, most of it, the 993 ships that had not joined Griffon's strike group, had collided with the human force that outmatched them, was more advanced in technology, and operated with a level of coordination that made it functionally different from any fleet battle in the recorded history of the Conclave. Human ships did not fight like most species. They did not rush forward to destroy. They moved between the Vorkai ships and the planet's surface, positioning themselves as a physical barrier, using their superior speed and maneuverability to prevent attacks rather than to inflict them. When the Vorkai ships fired, the human ships intercepted the shots not because they had to, but because the mathematics said it was more efficient than trying to neutralize the firing ship. And when they engaged in direct combat, when a Vorkai ship broke through the defensive line and became an active threat, the human reaction was precise, almost surgical. Weapons aimed at propulsion systems without affecting life support, targeting that disabled bridge controls while leaving the rest of the ship untouched. The ability to discharge a weapon through an opening the size of a porthole and hit the fire control processor behind it without scratch. The Vorkai ships were neutralized one by one. Their crews were intact, their hulls were intact, but they drifted, unable to move, unable to fight, simply present in space as a testament to what had just happened. No one died. This, somehow, was the most disturbing thing to the Vorkai fleet commanders. They understood combat. They understood destruction. They did not understand an enemy that seemed to expend as much effort to not kill them as a normal force would to do the opposite. Deputy Warlord Greffin, in the drifting Iron Fang, found that emergency comms were working and was shouting orders into his channel to the remaining active Vorkai ships. Shoot, attack, die before surrendering. Some of them listened. Most, looking at the drifting, silent figures of their neutralized comrades and the precise, impatient human ships moving between them and their targets, made the calculation that their fleet commander had made in the side room of the Pride of Vorkai hours ago. A calculation that stated this was not a battle they would win. Drakan was still on the Covenant channel. He had watched the fight from the beginning. He had spoken very little. He watched his ships being neutralized without being destroyed, one by one, with the efficiency of a cleaning operation, not a battle. He saw how Greffin's attack failed. He saw how the Meridian stood in the path of the Iron Fang and took the hit so that the planet would not be harmed. He saw all of it, and something was happening to him during this observation. Something for which there was no word in the Vorkai language, something that was appropriate. "I mean Voss," he said not long ago. He lifted his hand and removed the insignia of his command from his collar. It was a heavy engraved item. Rank, bloodline, and service record all pressed into the metal and worn over the heart. He had worn it for 30 years. He placed it on his command panel and opened a channel. "Voss," he said. She looked at him. "Yes? Tell your fleet to stop." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded to the Covenant, and the fleet channel opened. "All vessels," she said, "hold position. Maintain defensive lines. Do not engage." She turned back to Drekhan. "Combat operations are suspended," she said. He looked at the insignia on his panel. He paused, as something very large pauses when it decides to stop. "We call this Vetkiron," he said. "What I am doing." Vetkiron means acknowledging that the opponent has proven something. Not just that one has proven something. He met her gaze. The warlord who performs Vetkiron acknowledges that the opponent's strength is real, that the argument is over. He paused. "I perform Vetkiron." Voss looked at him without any expression of triumph. She just looked at him. "I accept this acknowledgement," she said, "and I want to be very clear about what happens next, so there is no ambiguity. Human assembly does not seek to control the Vorkai Dominion, to annex its territory, or to impose our rule on it. We seek 3 things: withdrawal from all occupied systems, the liberation of all enslaved peoples, and the beginning of a process, a long process. I know of accountability and restoration." She paused. "We are not your conquerors. We are not your rulers. We are the party that has come to tell you that what you have been doing to others will stop, and that stopping it does not necessarily mean your destruction." Drekhan was silent. "My people will not accept this easily," he said. "I know," Voss said. "It will take time. We understand that. We are not impatient." "You prepared for 3,000 years," he said. In his voice was something that might have been, for a Vorkai, a small and deeply reluctant admission of something akin to respect. "I suppose you are not." The emergency broadband channel that had been broadcasting the entire exchange was still open. In the conclave chamber, the senior diplomats were no longer sitting in their seats. Most of them were standing, watching the broadcast with the full attention that important things require. On Aethen Four, the Selhari Council had stopped arguing and gathered in one room around a single screen. On dozens of worlds that had survived the Archai conquest, people who had lost what could not be replaced were watching in the private darkness of their homes and their thoughts. And in the archive room on Aethen Four, Vansal finally moved. He moved slowly. He was old, and the last 3 days had been long, and he walked to his terminal and sat down. He found the file he was looking for, the archive record about humanity, the one that had been placed under the header Historical Records, unverified, the one marked with the status unknown, presumably extinct. He deleted the last 4 words. He sat for a moment, looking at the empty space where they had been. Then he thought about what to put in their place. He thought about the signal on the dead frequency, about the formation that the sensors could not count, about the meridian that stood between the planet and the ship because the math said it was right, about what Voss had said on the channel, about the contradiction, the cost, and the reason they had come anyway. He typed 4 words. They never truly left. He looked at it. Then he added a note in the small text field below, in the old scholarly style he had used for 60 years. Note: The archive record describing the civilization as dangerous was accurate. The archive record describing them as relentless was also accurate. What the archive did not note, and what I am recording here for those who will read this after me, is that they are relentless not for the sake of conquest, not for the sake of glory, and not for the sake of the survival of only themselves, but for the idea that no civilization should burn alone in the dark and hear nothing. In return, they retreated because they were not ready. They returned because they were finally ready. And they came not as rulers. They came as something the galaxy had never had before, and for which there was no word. They came as an answer. He saved the file. Outside, the burning sky of Aethen Four was changing. The Vorkai ships were no longer moving in attack formations. The bombardment had ceased in the silence after the guns. The natural sounds of the planet were returning. The distant noise of wind over the plains to the north of the city. The faint sounds of people on the streets below, beginning to realize that what they were sure would happen would not now happen. Fenlo walked over and stood next to Vansal and looked at the screen. He read the updated archive entry. He read it twice, then looked out the window at the sky. The human armada was still there, holding position in deep space behind the planet. Thousands of ships still in perfect formation, patient and steady in their presence, like a kept promise, real and solid, and exactly what it promised to be. "What now?" asked Fenlo. Vansal looked at the sky for a long time before answering. "What should have happened a very long time ago," he said. "Who starts cleaning up the mess?" He paused. "And this time, who stays to make sure it is done correctly?" He looked once more at the archive record. Then he closed the file, slowly stood, and walked to the window to look at the morning, a real morning, the one that was now arriving, now that the fires were extinguished and the guns had fallen silent, beginning to light the sky above Aethen Four. It was still a scarred sky. It would take time to heal, but it was lightening and was clear. And somewhere out there, in the cold and patient darkness beyond it, the armada held its position. It had come a very long way. It was not going anywhere. In the years that followed, the Conclave of Worlds established a unified restoration commission with human advisors at all levels. The 14 occupied systems were liberated. Greffon was tried by a joint tribunal and found guilty of war crimes under new Conclave protocols that human diplomats had spent 3 months drafting. Drekon did not stand trial. Instead, he served as the first witness for the prosecution against the Vorkai High Command. The 7th Conquest Fleet was officially disbanded. 3 of its ships, repaired and repainted, joined the new Conclave peacekeeping forces. The Meridian was repaired. Commander Chen was promoted. She named her next command ship after the planet she had protected. Vansal lived for another 11 years. Most of that time he spent updating the archive, not just the human files, but all of them. In his final public speech, before his health made travel impossible, he said that the most important thing archivists could do was to ensure that the record was honest about what had happened, so that the next generation would know that what was possible was not just war and loss, but times when everything went right, times when someone came. The archive record he had written never changed. They never truly left.